Welcome to the Stories Your City Forgot. I'm Justin Matson, and today we're exploring the 1924 murder of Robert Imbrie, an American diplomat stationed in Tehran. His killing wasn't just a tragic act of violence, it was a flashpoint that exposed American diplomacy abroad. With that in mind, let's let today's guest introduce themselves.
I'm Michael Zirinsky. I'm a professor emeritus in the history department at Boise State University. And what else would you like to know?
Well, you've brought a really interesting story forward today. The attack and murder of U.S. Vice Consul Robert Imbrie. So let's start with who is Robert Imbrie? This is an interesting guy.
Well, Imbrie was, in the final analysis, a Foreign Service officer who was assigned as a consul to Tabriz in northwestern Iran by the then head of the Near Eastern Affairs Department of the State Department, a young man named Allen Dulles, who of course went on to be the head of the CIA after World War II. Imbrie had an interesting life before World War I, but when the war broke out, he volunteered to be an ambulance driver in the French army and was assigned to the Salonika front, where the Allies were, primarily the French, were fighting against the Bulgarians. And after some time with that, out of which he got a book, he was able to join the Foreign Service, which sent him at the end of the war to Russia, where he was, after the break in diplomatic relations with the Bolshevik Revolution, became the last American diplomat in the country and had an interesting career, at least according to what I've seen in the records, fighting against the Bolsheviks, who eventually threw him out of the country. And so the State Department assigned him to a nearby post in the newly independent country of Finland, where he was running spies into the Soviet Union. And when that was discovered, he was thrown out of there, and they reassigned him to Istanbul, which by this time the war was over and was under Allied occupation. And he was ostensibly sent there to try to work with White Russian forces that were opposing the communists. But by the time he got there, the Whites had lost the war, and so he had an interesting time in Istanbul for a while, which is where he met Allen Dulles. And he was eventually assigned to Ankara to establish relations with the new Turkish nationalist government, which was not yet recognized by the Allies, but he was able to negotiate some interesting economic agreements, which never came to fruition, but he made friends not only in the State Department, but with economic interests as well. Unfortunately for his career, he was denounced as being anti-Armenian. This is at the time immediately after the Armenian massacres, the so-called Armenian genocide. The word genocide had not yet been invented, but it is clearly a early 20th century genocide. And so he was called back to Washington, where he was sharply criticized, but eventually cleared of any wrongdoing and reassigned to Iran. And he never got to Tabriz because he was replacing a consul in Tehran who was home on leave and had only been there a very short time when he had this uncomfortable relationship with the mob in Tehran.
Yeah, and this is a fascinating guy. Like, that sounds like a movie-worthy experience, don't you think? Moving from Russia to Finland to Istanbul, right? Like, that is something straight out of a spy novel. Like, you can't make it up.
Well, Well, it's one of these cases where it does seem that truth is more interesting than any fiction. And he indeed was a spy, although at that time the U.S. didn't have a spy agency, so he was operating under the cover of the State Department. And one of the things that's always struck me, particularly when various people who are diplomats or journalists are accused of being spies, that whole concept of spying is um, something that we don't like. On the other hand, there's a very fine line between a reasonable collection of information that's public to anyone and this spying, which implies that you're going where you're not supposed to go and violating the unwritten or written compact on which you're there. And Imbrie was someone who I think was an intelligence officer, but what he was doing was certainly within the normal activity of a consular official, which is to collect information for the government on the basis of which it makes decisions and to assist private enterprise in dealing with the country to which he is assigned. And one of the things that he was apparently assigned to do was to try to negotiate or to help private enterprise negotiate an oil agreement with the Iranian government. And that's where he got involved in some interesting political questions, both with the Bolsheviks, who had interests in the north of Iran, and with the British, who were ostensibly our allies in the First World War. They certainly were, but who were rivals in the oil business. There was a phrase that appeared in the British archives that I found irresistible about the Americans trying to get their fingers into the oil can. The British at that time regarded the Iranian oil industry as their private enterprise. They had negotiated an agreement. They had developed the drilling apparatus. They had laid the pipeline. They had built the refinery. And it was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which today is BP.
Wow. And yeah, so you also mentioned that this is around the same time that Mr. Imbrie, gets caught up in some interesting political questions. Can you kind of set the scene of what's going on in Iran as Robert Imbrie is getting there?
Well, it's a very interesting situation. And I must say that when you had me introduce myself, I didn't give you some of my relevant background. In fact, I went to high school in Tehran in the 1950s when the United States was in very good odor with the government, a government which in fact had been assisted into power in a coup d'etat in 1953, which was initiated in fact by the British, who were upset at the possibility of losing their oil interests. So, to go into the background, in the First World War, Iran was ostensibly neutral, but its government was traditional and it was exceedingly weak. It had no army whatsoever. The only military force that had any efficiency in the country was officered by the Russians and was basically an agency of the Russian government, although it was ostensibly there to protect the Shah. When the war broke out, very shortly after the Guns of August, the Turks were induced by the Germans to join in the fight against the Russians. And in the late autumn of 1914, they began moving troops towards Russia, going through their zone of influence in northern Iran. And this meant that for the next 4 years, Iran was a battlefield in the war between the Allies and the Central Powers. When the war was over in Europe, it continued to be chaotic in Iran. The Russians had collapsed and withdrawn. The Turks had collapsed and withdrawn, and the British were left on the field, and they were under pressure to leave the country, not only by the Iranians who wanted them gone, but by the British Treasury, which pulled its funding. And so in 1921, as the British army was preparing to withdraw once the snows melted in the passes and it could walk back to Iraq, which was British occupied by this time, local officials arranged for British assistance to a colonel in the Cossack regiment to seize power. And this was a man named Reza Khan, who was eventually to make himself Shah in 1925, after 4 years of organizing order in the country by means of his military forces. The short version, which I never seemed able to give, is that Reza was a modernizer. He was a patriot. He was opposed to all foreign influence, but he needed to work the realities as they were. And he was very much interested in what was going on in Turkey, which had by this time emerged as a nationalist and eventually Republican form of government, led by a man who eventually took the name of Ataturk, the father of the Turks, a secularist. And Reza, in some regards, was someone who modeled his career on what Ataturk had done. And so when Ataturk created a republic, there was a movement suddenly in Iran to create an Iranian republic to get rid of the old inefficient monarchy, which had become essentially a pawn to anyone who would pay for what they needed to keep themselves in comfort. And at the point where this Republican movement was gaining favor, suddenly the Ataturk government in Ankara decided, having already abolished the Sultanate, to abolish the Caliphate as well. And this worried the religious authorities in Iran, even though Turkey was Sunni and Iran was Shia. And they saw a republic suddenly as something that was anti-Islam. And so there was a moment when it looked like Reza might actually be bounced from power by the power of the ulama in Iran to move the masses to express their opinion. And in order to counter this, Reza made various movements to try to pacify the Islamic leaders. He went to Qom, he talked to the authorities, he made a pilgrimage to the holy sites in Iraq to appease those religious leaders as well. And one of the things that he did was to tacitly, I don't think there was any explicit discussion of it, to allow the religious authorities to create a mass movement against the Baha'is. Now, the Baha'is are a religious movement which began in Iran in the 19th century. They were reformist, they were modernist, they eventually were considered by themselves and by the West, to the extent that it knows about them, as a separate religion, even though it grew out of Islam, as Islam grew out of the Judeo-Christian tradition that was known in Arabia at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. But to the religious authorities in Iran, the Baha'i faith is anathema, and it is not given the religious toleration that is extended to Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians in Iran. And so riots broke out. And Imbrie, in fact, walked into a riot waiting to happen, given the public mood in the streets of Tehran on that Friday noon, on the eve of the Shia most holy day of Ashura, celebrating, the wrong word, the mourning of the killing of the Shi'i imams at the Battle of Karbala. So all of this is to say that, short version, Imbrie was ignorant about Iranian realities, and he found himself in a situation which he had not anticipated. He went with a camera to take photographs, which he had done in Turkey when he was assigned there. And the photographs in Turkey were published after his death in the National Geographic magazine with his essay that accompanied them. And he was identified erroneously as a Baha'i. The whole situation was very unclear at the time. There were many rumors that are recorded in the archives, but the story that I wrote seemed to fit with most of the facts that I could figure out, both from the archival record and from what had been written about other things as well.
Yeah, and this is what I think is fascinating, is he finds himself on that Friday, June the 22nd of 1956. He walks in, he takes...
No,
go ahead.
1924.
1924. Oh, 1956 is when your family moved to Tehran. My fault.
Right.
My fault.
Yes.
That's what I get
Right.
for...
It's July, I think the 16th of 1924.
Yes, yeah, you are correct. I'm so sorry. Your Blood, Power, and Hypocrisy paper says June 18th, 1924. Man, what a blunder on my fault.
Well, easy to happen.
It can happen when you're working with so many numbers and dates. And so he takes this photo, and he finds himself in the middle of a mob where he and his partner that had been assigned to him, a oil roughneck, had just started to get beaten. So what led up to this event? So he's there, he's taking the photos. How many photos does he get? What's going on? And
well, as far as I know, there were no photos ever found. Whether he took them or not, I don't know. But the background, there was at this time, and indeed when I was there 30 years later, no public water distribution. The water that people used, and it's essential, of course, came in the form of underground channels called ganats and surface canals called jubes. And drinking water was usually provided from the ganats by men who were known as sakas, who would deliver this either in donkey-drawn carts or in leather bags that they carried on their shoulders. And there would be places often set up known as a sakakhana, where someone would be selling water or making it available in return for a paid blessing to the saints or something of that sort. And there was a sakakhana in Tehran at this time that became regarded in the Western accounts of it as a miraculous fountain. In fact, what the Western accounts say of this is that a Baha'i was offered water if he made obeisance to the saints. He refused, and he was struck blind. But when he then drank with the water after he made his payment and prayed appropriately, his sight was miraculously restored. Now, I have great dubiousness about whether this in fact happened, but this was the rumor that was current in Tehran. And so the Sakhakhane accumulated lots of people who were interested in drinking from it, making payments to the man who was running it, and praying appropriately. And so this was a stir, and Imbrie went to investigate. In retrospect, he should have known that just before noon on Friday, the crowds gather to go to the public places of worship, whether in mosques or on the street. Iranians pray and pray together by preference, which is what a mosque is for. And furthermore, he should have known about the sensitivity that surrounds the moment of Ashura, at the end of the 10 days of mourning for the disaster at Karbala. It is the highest point of the religious calendar in Shi'i Islam, and in Iranian tradition, certainly in the 19th and early 20th century, this involved ritual cursing of the Sunnis who had killed the sainted Hussein, and it also involved, in terms of the iconography that's recorded in paintings, emphasized the evil of other people who had opposed the Shi'i regime in Iran. So that you see in the 19th century images of Englishmen and Russians who are alongside the images of the Umayyad caliphs who had done this horrible deed. And so you have this stew, if you will, of religious enthusiasm that is combined with the political moment where everything is up in the air. And so things happen. And one of the things that I just lost one of my ears. I have to find it. Can we take a moment?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know where it's gone. It just dropped out. It can't have. Well, I can't see it. Oh, it fell into my shirt pocket. Sorry about that.
No worries. So things happen.
Okay, so yeah, things happen. So when I went to Washington to research this, I in fact arrived at a moment in American history that is arguably comparable to the moment in Iranian history that Imbrie was engaged in. It was at the tail end of the so-called hostage crisis. And in fact, the day that I received my first documents at the National Archives in Washington, then housed in the old archives building downtown, was the day that the hostages came to be greeted by newly inaugurated President Ronald Reagan at the White House. And while I was waiting for the documents, a rumor swept through the reading room that the hostages were going to come by on Pennsylvania Avenue right outside the building. And so everybody went down to stand and wave. And while we were waiting, nicely on the curb on the south side of Pennsylvania Avenue, a rumor swept through the crowd, which was, composed mostly of government workers, that, the buses were going to come on the other side of the road. And so suddenly, as if choreographed, everyone on the curb marched to the center lane. The police were there in small numbers trying to hold back the crowd, but they couldn't. The crowd had a mind of its own. And one of the things that this reinforced is the academic knowledge that I already had, that crowds take on a life of their own. Whether or not they are planned, and this certainly was not a planned one, uh, things can happen on the basis of rumors going through. And so, when the crowd in Tehran heard somebody say, "This is a Baha'i," suddenly the enthusiasm of the month of Muharram um, resulted in a riot which got totally out of hand. And, that's how I interpret the confusing records that are maintained by the American and British archives that were created by the diplomats in Tehran at that time. Um, so that is what happened. The aftermath, of course, is particularly interesting because it really reinforces the message that Reza Khan, who was then prime minister, was trying to reinforce, that he was the only thing standing between chaos and order. And so ultimately, he was able to gain the support of the religious authorities and also the support of the diplomatic missions, Soviet as well as European and American.
Yeah, I think the aftermath here is really fascinating because he gets beat not once, not twice, but three times, right? Um, he gets beat once in the street. When does it happen the second time?
Well, when they catch up to him in the carriage and he's
Uh,
beaten the second time there. And then he's taken to the hospital where he is attacked again by a crowd that by that time was full of Cossacks, including officers.
yeah, this is what's really fascinating is it goes from one crowd to a completely different crowd. What do you think caused that for it to spread like a wildfire through two different crowds?
Well, I think it's not two different crowds. I think it's three different incidents, and the crowd kept getting bigger and bigger as everybody heard there was something going on, joined the crowd, and then the rumor says you ask what's happening. Well, it's a Baha'i who is trying to do nasty things, and so he needs to be attacked.
Yeah, really unlucky situation Mr. Imbrie finds himself in. And so he does end up actually passing away from this series of incidents. What is the US response for when this happens?
Well, the response from Washington was, as far as I can tell, orchestrated by Alan Dulles. Um, and he is responding not only to what happened in Iran, but also to how the press is playing this. And this was page one news around the country at the time. And there is a hysteria that is comparable, I think, to what we have seen repeatedly in recent years in terms of attitudes towards the evil country of the day. Today it's Iran again. Some time ago it was Iraq. Before that it was Afghanistan. And I think that there is this tradition, if you will, of seeing the world through a prism of the Crusades, the medieval conflict between Christendom and Islam. And Islam is always, from the point of view of Christians, the evil force, the other that needs to be dealt with. Now, I'm thinking of an early episode in U.S. history, which I haven't really contemplated deeply since I encountered it as a high school student in Tehran, in fact, where we had a senior course in U.S. history in my school that was very well done. In the early 19th century, when Thomas Jefferson was president, a generation before the French began to colonize North Africa, the United States Navy had good relations with the Ottomans. In fact, there is a treaty that was negotiated early in our history that makes a point of saying that the American government is not a Christian government. It recognizes all religions equally. But the Ottomans did not control all of the Muslim forces in North Africa that were nominally part of their empire. And so we have the episode of the so-called Barbary pirates who made their living by sending out ships and raiding or taxing and occasionally enslaving the crews of the ships that they took. And so there is an episode in which an American ship is taken over. The sailors are enslaved. American opinion is outraged. We send in the Marines to the shores of Tripoli, which is, of course, the phrase of the Marine hymn. And this is a repeated theme in American history, which I think of from the point of view of trying to understand what's going on in the present day, which I've been doing at Boise State when I was teaching from the 70s right through into the 21st century, where there are repeated episodes, especially including the Iranian Revolution, the emergence of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the fight against Saddam Hussein in Iraq in particular, but also Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. So there is this strong sense, which, if I go back to the question that you posed, in 1924, this is how is seen in the American press. And so Dulles is reacting to that as well as to the natural outrage of having a diplomat who is commonly to be protected by the host government killed in the course of his duties. And I'm aware of this because, among other things, there is a wall in the State Department building that lists all of the Foreign Service officers who died while on active service. And most of the early ones who died of disease in places that were unsanitary at a time when many parts of the United States were unsanitary and people died of disease far more often than they do today. And Imbrie is one of the earliest, if not the very first, Foreign Service officer to be killed in the line of duty by a hostile attack. And so this is an outrage from the point of view of a diplomat. And I think the two encouraged him to demand satisfaction. And the demand took the form, first of all, of demanding justice. But justice, as I read the archives in the mind, was wanting blood to be shed for the blood that was shed by Imbrie. And so trying to make nice to the West. Uh, Reza Khan, who was Minister of War as well as Prime Minister at this time, arranged for a. Um, my camera has gone off. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you. I my
Fine.
my camera is sometimes just does that. Keep on going.
Well, that's a okay. So Reza arranged for court martials for three people who were plucked out of the mob. Um, one was a private soldier, one was a camel driver, and the third one was a theological student, a talib. And I think the fact that these were three separate categories uh, was quite deliberate, although there's no hint in the archives that they were, choosing from various categories. All three of these young men were teenagers, and the court martial uh, convicted them and sentenced them to death. Reza Khan, acting on behalf of the king who was gone from the country by this time, uh, commuted two of the sentences to imprisonment. The United States demanded that all three be killed. And the document, the documentation that has Dulles' hands all over it, um, is quite clear that he was motivated by anti-Muslim prejudice. He talked explicitly about human life as such is not valued by Orientals. This is a cliche I had encountered years before I ever saw this in the State Department documents. And in later years, when he testified about this to Congress, he said something which I will quote from memory. You've got it in the accurate form in what you see there, that when you get a Muslim to be executed for taking the life of a Christian, it does wonderful things for the prestige of our country. This goes, in terms of the terminology, beyond what seems to me to be reasonable in terms of the outrage and desire for justice. It seems clear to me that the three young men who were identified were in fact people who were chosen not because they were guilty, but because they were representatives. They were merely stops to American opinion. And that too is very disturbing.
Yeah, it's extremely disturbing. This is really the whole thing is kind of gross from a national politics kind of stage, right? And so British officials actually had a slightly different opinion. Was I reading that correctly?
I think the British had far more experience in Iran and far more interest in maintaining their influence than the United States. I mean, taking the long view until World War II, when American policy changed quite dramatically, the American position was basically to regard Iran as not of particular interest. And to the extent that after World War II and the communists coming to power in Russia, to regard it basically as a British area of influence. And so I think the British were more reasonable. What I discovered was that there was a case in which a British non-com who had stayed on after the war was killed, and the British didn't particularly protest. But it's not really a similar kind of case. because Imbrie was an accredited diplomat. He was not the minister, but he was in fact the consul, and as such had diplomatic immunity and should have been protected by the host country. And the fact that Reza's government was willing to offer these people and to pay an indemnity, which was also demanded by the United States, a blood money, if you will, although that is not something that exists in American law, is an indication that he understood, that Reza understood that he should have protected. But of course, the idea of protection is one thing, but when a person is free to wander around the city without any constraints, is hard to enforce. And this brings me back to my personal involvement in this, if you will, which when I first wrote about it, I did not talk about it all, but when I revisited it for the Foreign Service Journal, I did make a point of it. In 1956, when we arrived, I received a birthday present of a camera. And when I got it, my parents warned me that there was this story that they had heard about a young Foreign Service officer being killed for taking photographs. And so to be very careful and not take photographs in public. And so mostly I didn't. I have very few photos that I took in those years. But the other side of the story is that as a teenager in Tehran, I felt absolutely free to wander around wherever I wanted, to stick my nose into the bazaars. I did not go into mosques, but otherwise, I rode the buses, I rode taxi cabs, I talked to people on the streets, and I think that was the norm for people in Iran, perhaps more so for men than for women who had different instructions, if you will, in part because of rumors, and in part because of the fact that they did not wear modest clothing by Islamic standards. Although when I look back at how women dressed in the 1950s, other than the fact that they didn't cover their hair in public, there's very little to complain about from the point of view of Islamic modesty. People were not going out that early in sleeveless blouses, and certainly not in shorts. And the shirt and the skirts were well below the knee. So the Islamic modesty was, how can I say this? They were foreigners. They were treated as guests in the country, and there were, to my knowledge, none of the kind of problems that cropped up in the 20 years later in the 1970s, when the numbers of Americans in Tehran had jumped from 2,000 to something like 25,000, and people paid no attention to where they were and how they should be.
Yeah,
So
and
it's a very different situation.
it is crazy how much things change the more they stay the same, isn't it? Um,
Well, yes. Um, that's a very good cliche.
yeah, it's a good cliche because it's so applicable in many different spots. And so, following the murder of Mr. Imbrie, what is going on politically in Iran? This kind of gives the prime minister the ability to start taking some, let's say, executive actions.
Well, I don't think there's any particular change. There's a if I can go back to the World War I episode, which is in fact what I'm working on now. Excuse me while I take a drink.
No worries.
I'm not used to lecturing for an hour without stopping,
No worries at all.
as once I did regularly. Anyway, um, in World War One, the Turkish armies were preceded by paramilitary forces that were basically Kurdish tribesmen who had been outfitted with military gear and uniforms to act as a cavalry force before their infantry. In the south, the Germans during the war were not present in great numbers, but they had lots of gold. And they encouraged, with payment, um, tribal elements who were not particularly pro-British to fight against the British. And so you had organized disorder throughout much of the country. And when the Turks and the Russians withdrew and the Germans were defeated, um, the British literally, and here I'm quoting the then new British minister, Sir Percy Cox, who came in late 1918, um, that Persia is an outstanding ulcer of chaos in the civilized world. And so, what the British wanted to do to protect their interests in the oil fields, to protect the borders with India, which was then part of the British Empire, it was the Indian Empire, um, to protect their newly acquired territory in what is now Iraq, as well as their older positions in the uh, sheikdoms and emirates around the Persian Gulf. They wanted to establish order, and to that end, Cox had been sent to negotiate a treaty which would give the British the kind of relationship with the ruling authorities that it already had in India, in the Emirates, in Oman, in Qatar, in Kuwait, and were about to establish in Iraq. And this became a treaty which it was inked in 1919, and it never came into force because the um, Iranians regarded it as illegitimate because they understood that Cox had bribed the people who signed it in order to get their signatures. And so when the British Army was forced to withdraw because the Treasury cut off its funding, local officials acting without the authority either of the British minister in Tehran or the Foreign Office or the War Office in London arranged for British support for Reza to seize power in a coup in 1921. And once he was in office as first commander of the army, then war minister, then prime minister, he began a process of pacification, which was precisely what the British had wanted to do in the first place. And this involved sending out military forces into the provinces to bring the tribes into submission. And one of the things that happened more or less at the same time that he was seizing power and beginning this process is that the Persian minister, the Iranian minister in Washington, arranged for an arrangement which was essentially part of what the British had hoped to do out of London. He arranged for the negotiation of loans by American banks to replace the loan that the British had proposed in their agreement in 1919. He arranged for a financial mission comparable to what the British had intended for Iran in the treaty that was stillborn. And this financial mission was headed by an American who had worked both in the overseas territories of the United States, and at the time he decided to accept employment by the Iranian government, was the petroleum advisor to the State Department. And so Arthur Millspaugh headed a mission on a 5-year contract that ran from 1922 to 1927, if I remember correctly, and organized finances in Iran, which created a situation in which he was collecting the taxes and dispersing the money to the government, which was spending the money on the armed forces, which went out into the provinces to collect the taxes. And you had to collect the taxes, you had to bring the tribes into order. And so you have a process of creating order that by the time 1925 rolls around, had established Reza as an effective dictator, not just a figurehead dictator in Tehran. And so the episode of the Republic is sort of a bump on the road. And the Imbrie affair is an important part of the grease, I'm mixing my metaphors here, that enables the machinery of government to get over the bump in the road towards establishing a firm central government. And if I step back for a moment to compare the 19th century tradition, which ends in 1921, with the 20th century tradition, which continues into the 21st century, Iran in the old days was totally decentralized. The government of the Qajar dynasty, which was deposed in 1925, has been described as one of the Shah selling the governorship of the provinces to the highest bidder. And the highest bidder would then know that his governorship wasn't going to last very long, so he had to squeeze as much taxes out of the population as possible, because he was going to be replaced, and he had to make sure that he made a profit. And so this is a formula for resentment on the part of the people towards the government, and also for increasing impoverishment of the people at the hands of what passes for government. And so this decentralized and weak government, which did not have an army, is replaced in the 20th century with a highly centralized government, which throws all the resources it can into the military structure, which enables it to call the country together and, if you'll pardon the expression, make Persia great again. And so, Reza Khan is entirely consistent from the moment he comes into power in 1921 until the time in 1941 when the British ease him out of power after invading the country in World War II and encouraging him to abdicate in favor of his then 21-year-old son. And the result is, again, if I take the long view, in this 20 years between 21 and 41, Iran is reborn as a strong centralized government. It may not be strong compared to Russia, compared to Britain, compared to America, but compared to what it had been in the 19th century, it is remarkably changed. And yet the culture hasn't changed at all. The position of the religious authorities may have been reduced because they no longer can call out crowds to oppose what the government is doing now that the government has an effective military and police force, but they are still there educating people and maintaining the Islamic ideals in the minds of the people.
Yeah, the Imbrie affair is extremely interesting because it is a moment in history where it feels like everything changes. Right? Like you have a lot of moving pieces that all suddenly have to recalibrate.
I think that's fair to say, although I would say that the Embry piece of it is a very small piece, and it is one that I thought was remarkable when I discovered it. And again, this is probably something that I should have said in the beginning in terms of how I came onto it. This is maybe a question you should have asked to start with. What happened uh, was that I was new at Boise State in the 1970s. And I had my first sabbatical leave immediately after the revolution in Iran. And I had not done a dissertation on Iran, but I was fascinated with it and wanted to deal with it. And so when I had the opportunity for a semester's leave at pay, I went to the archives and I thought, I had this vague idea. I'm going to look into what the origins of American relations with Iran were, because there was virtually no literature at that time. So I read what I hadn't already read, which wasn't very much because I had read most of what was available. And I looked specifically at the printed records of the State Department, a massive collection of volumes called the Foreign Relations of the United States of America. We usually abbreviated as FRUS. And, I went through everything there was up until the end of publication, which by that time went up to World War II, and I don't think very much further than that. And I found this very strange entry for 1924, which said, in more or less these words and not any longer, the State Department wanted to publish the records of the murder of Major Imbrie, but the Iranian government objected to publication of some of them, and so will not publish any of them. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And so when I got to the State Department archives in Washington, I said I wanted to look at this. And the archivist, who of course had been sitting there watching America Held Hostage after work every night, Ted Koppel's famous show, were primed, and they knew all the records, and they directed me to them. And so in fairly short order, I was able to take notes on all the records and, go as well to the Library of Congress and look at the congressional record for the things that were recorded there. And the result was the article that you read that was published in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, which in a sense was my first publication. And it's always struck me as one of these things that grew out of my experience in Tehran as a high school student and of being attuned to things that people who were commenting merely on the basis of things they had read elsewhere maybe weren't attuned to. And this whole business of photography was a particular thing that struck me about it at the time. Although I think it's probably the least of the things that is key.
And was there anything that really surprised you when you were doing this research? Was there anything that really stuck out to you as like, oh, that's interesting?
Well, I think the two comments that I found in the record from Dulles struck me as most undiplomatic. And part of this, I think, is the difference in public attitudes between the two centuries. I mean, this is an event that took place more than a century ago. And in the 1920s, the whole notion of Orientals being different than you and I. For a generation raised, if you will, on the writings of Rudyard Kipling, this sort of attitude does not seem out of place in 1924. But by the time I was looking at it in the early 1980s, it struck me as horribly racist, which of course reinforces the fact that the racism of American society was not as clear in the publications that one would read if you were not African American as they are today. And for example, there is the old phrase, which is now about as acceptable as the N word in public discourse, of being free, white, and 21, meaning you could do anything you wanted to do. The racist implications of that were totally ignored, certainly by me when I first heard it, but I think in society as a whole. And so one of the things that certainly struck me about this is the obliviousness, if you will, of the American press, of the American Congress, of the American State Department to the attitudes between we, the people, if you will, us, and them, the others who were classed as Orientals. Well, what is an Oriental? You know, anyone who is from east of the Bosphorus, east of the center of the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, it ultimately comes down to people who are not part of the Christendom that we studied in our European and American history courses. So that's one thing that really struck me. Another, which is perhaps also something that is mind-bending to people in the 1980s or the 2020s, is how difficult it was to get to Iran. And one of the things that in this initial research that popped up was a pair of communications between the State Department and the newly appointed, I think in 1922, minister to Iran, whose name I'm going to have to dredge up from an old memory. Saul Joseph Kornfeld. Now, Saul Joseph Kornfeld was a surprise to and a disappointment to the State Department. He was a political crony of President Harding. He was a rabbi. He was not American born. He was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And one of the things that if you study the literature on the sociology, if you will, of the State Department in the 1920s, it was definitely anti-Semitic. And so the idea of a political crony taking the place of a career Foreign Service officer as minister in Tehran, much less a rabbi, was below the surface, but it was there. And so the exchange of telegrams. Minister Kornfeld announced his arrival in Tehran. The State Department immediately responded, I don't remember the words, but the essence of it was, what the hell took you so long? It took him almost 3 months. And he responded in detail by saying, well, first, I took the evening congressional, or maybe it was the senator, I don't remember which one goes north, the railroad train from Union Station in Washington to Penn Station in New York. And then I had to check into my hotel because the ship I was taking to Britain hadn't yet docked. And so after a few days, he gets on board the ship. It takes a week or perhaps more to travel, and then to Southampton, I think. And then he took the train to London, checked into his hotel, and went a round of consultations with the American Embassy in London and with the British Foreign Office. And then he got on another train to Southampton and got on another boat to Bombay, which took him probably 2 or 3 weeks. And at Bombay, he had to wait for another boat to take him to Basra at the head of the Gulf in Iraq. And then he took the train to Baghdad and received word that the passes into Persia were not yet open. They were snowbound. And so when he got the word that they were open, then he took his car, he had cars sent ahead, and he took the train to the pass, where he discovered that the pass was not yet clear enough for cars. And so he had to hire a crowd of men with shovels to clear the road so he could get through. And then it was more or less clear sailing to Tehran. And so this is also a part of the story. And it was actually some years after I discovered and published about the Imbrie story that someone told me about a fantastic silent film that had been remastered and was available to watch, which I urge you to do just to get a sense of what this is all about. The film is called Grass, and the people who made it were the people who later went on to make King Kong, the original King Kong. And they were accompanied by a woman whose name I should remember, who was a subject of a recent biography by someone whose name I've forgotten, who also had done a very famous biography earlier, decades earlier, about Gertrude Bell, who was instrumental in the creation of Iraq as the Oriental Secretary to Sir Percy Cox when he was High Commissioner there. And Grass is basically the story of the filming of the migration of a group of Bakhtiari tribesmen from their winter quarters to their summer quarters. And the film is a bit of a hokey travelogue to start with, but they basically start out in the Mediterranean and they go overland through what is now Jordan and Eastern Anatolia until they finally, and Iraq, I presume. I'm not very clear as to the exact path that they took until they finally get to the winter quarters of the Bakhtiari tribe. And then they record the movement of thousands of people and their animals from the winter quarters, which are low in an area that is soon going to have its grass shriveled by summer heat in the intense heat of southern Iran near the oil fields of the British. And they go over a major river in flood, the Karun, crossing it in goatskin rafts that they blow up with their own breath, with people and the smaller animals on board and the larger animals swimming, fording the river. And then they head to the major mountain range that they have to cross, which is still snow covered in the pass. And they get to the snow and they take off their shoes because the shoes don't have traction. And so barefoot, they climb over the pass, which goes to maybe 10,000 feet, with the women carrying not only their infant children on their backs, but some of the smaller animals that can't make the walk by themselves. Now, among other things, this is an indication of how strong as individuals and as a group the tribes are. The Bakhtiari tribes are one of the most important of the confederations that had controlled the country before Reza Khan. And the Bakhtiari, in fact, were one of the tribal groups that Britain subsidized in order to protect the oil fields. And the Bakhtiari were abandoned by the British when they decided to back Reza Khan, later Reza Khan, as bringing order to the country as a whole. And oh yes, the film ends with a certificate that it was in fact true and that these people had actually made this voyage to take the film. And the certificate is signed by Robert Imbrie just a few days before he died.
Wow. Wow. What? That is crazy. And so you could watch this movie and get a sense for...
I have done it many times. I have showed it in class. And the version I have has wonderful Persian music as a background. No spoken word, but the titles that were originally broadcast. The film was reviewed in the New York Times when it opened, and there's a poster that I think is a picture in the review. Somehow I have it in my mind. In any case, I've got an image of the poster and that I pulled off the web, and I've gotten the review from the web. It's not much of a review, but it opened on Broadway, I believe.
Wow. And that's all because, I mean, it's really interesting that Robert Imbrie is kind of ubiquitous in this area at this time. Like, he signs this paper, and then he just has a really just the story of a guy having the worst day of his life, really.
Well, yeah, the last day of his life.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a quick question. Did you ever see the film Reds?
I have not.
Oh, it's a great film. It's about the Russian Revolution, and it focuses on John Reed, who is an American journalist who famously said, "I have seen the future and it works," in describing the Bolshevik Revolution. And Reed was accompanied by, let's see, Warren Beatty made the film, and he plays John Reed. And I'm forgetting the name of the actress who plays his girlfriend, wife, whose name I also am not dredging up, but the actress who plays her was one of Woody Allen's exes, the best of them in a sense. I'm not dredging anyway, but the John Reed's wife, her name was on the tip of my tongue, and it's just not coming. I hope I dredge it up before this is over. When John Reed died during the revolution of typhus, I believe, in the one of the diseases that killed so many people during the famine and unrest of the Russian Civil War. But his wife survived, and she went on to become the second wife, I believe, of an important American diplomat, William Bullitt. Now, Bill Bullitt, who was, if I remember correctly, Philadelphia aristocracy, um, had been assigned by Woodrow Wilson to try to open relations with the Bolsheviks. And so he went on a mission that has nothing to do with Imbrie, but it's more or less at the same time. And eventually, not while he was in Russia at that time, he became first involved with and then married to Louise Bryant. Now, when Imbrie got in trouble with the State Department when he was assigned to Ankara, where he married, it was because Louise Bryant had complained about him. And at that time, she was, I believe, already involved with Bullitt. But I may be a little vague on the time frame there. Later on, when FDR became president and began to move towards opening relations with the Soviet Union in 1934, I think is when it happened, it was Bill Bullitt who was the first American ambassador to Soviet Russia. By which time I think Louise Bryant had gone away from his relationship. I mean, he recognized her as a very interesting woman, a very interesting person, but maybe not good for his diplomatic career. And so, they divorced, if I'm remembering correctly. But I urge you to see Reds as well. I haven't seen it since it came out, and it played at it was probably then the Egyptian, or maybe it was still the Ada Theater, as it was when I first came to town in 1973, a lifetime ago. Several lifetimes ago. Anyway, Reds.
Grass
Warren
and
Beatty.
Reds. Those are the movies.
Yeah, Grass and Reds.
All right.
Let's hear it for one-word titles.
We love one-word titles. Sinners, right? Like, that's a movie everybody keeps talking about. They love that one. So when we're thinking about this event 100 years later, what do you think is really important to consider when you think about this?
Well, to me, the most important aspect of it is how it reveals the worst side of American engagement with the rest of the world. Because part of the background of my thinking about this is the fact that I went to high school in Tehran in an American mission school. And the American missionaries, Presbyterians, had gone to Iran as early as the 1830s. They explored the field in 1829. They established their first station in about 1834. And until World War II, and this is more or less a quote from the later 1930s in a State Department document, they remained the most important American influence in Iran, activity in Iran, involvement, interest, I think is the word the State Department used. And they laid a foundation of good relations with Iran and played an important role in transferring universal aspects of Western civilization to the Iranian milieu by educating substantial numbers of Iranians in their schools and providing modern medical care in places where it didn't exist. And when the United States began to expand its interest in World War II, initially just to provide Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union in the fight against the Nazis. They explicitly said that, and here I'm quoting a historian who was in fact Iranian born, who became a professor at an American college, who heard it from, if you will, the horse's mouth in Tehran during the war, that he had not known how much goodwill had been created by the missionaries, and we must take advantage of it. And so the early development of American expertise on Iran during World War II and in the generation following was based on what had been learned by missionaries. And it included a number of important people who left the mission service during the Second World War to join the service of the United States government. Some were American missionaries, others were people who had been trained in the mission schools. And one of the things that strikes me as I look at what happened in 1953 and afterwards is the extent to which the American government ignored the advice of the people who knew more than just the facts, more than just what the government in Tehran was saying, but who had a deep understanding of the country. And I think that this is something that has been ignored, certainly by the press, to a great extent by the pundits, and certainly by the politicians who make our policy. And so we've gotten into serious problem. One of my high school friends was the child of missionaries and grew up before her father was forced to retire by age, stepfather actually, when she was 16. Is really remarkable. You know, she grew up in the provincial city of Rasht. And when she was a young girl, people were very friendly, including the religious Iranian authorities. When she came back after the coup in 1953, suddenly things were very, very different. People were, she and her friends were yelled at on the streets, stoned even, by people who understood that Americans were the enemy. Whereas before the coup, we were the great hope to protect Iran from the dangerous Russians and the dangerous British. And this, I think, is attributable certainly to the role we played in the coup of 1953, but I think more seriously to the tone deafness of American policy with regard to Iranian realities. Now, of course, you know, people who want to understand the country and get along with the country and don't want to influence the country, and that may include missionaries as well as academics, have one set of ideas about how to proceed. People who are interested in military power, interested in commercial success, people who are interested in political alliances against other countries have an obviously different take on it. But as an academic, it seems to me that our policies towards Iran have gone seriously wrong because of reliance on prejudices rather than on efforts to understand what Iran's all about and to build on that.
I think that is a perfect way to encapsulate kind of the entire story, right? You've got the tone deafness, you've got vested interests, and then everything being handled pretty poorly on a diplomatic scale, with not understanding the culture and not understanding what's going on. I think that is a perfect stopping place. For someone who really enjoyed listening to you today, where can they find more of your work?
I have relatively little published, but I have a lot of stuff on missionaries. I can send you a CV.
Absolutely. I would love that, and we will get that out there to the audience. Thank you so much for taking the time with me today.
Okay. One thing I would add that I am working on this other thing that I mentioned, and it's I've yet to find a publisher, but the manuscript, at least as I've conceived it, is more or less complete. So you might want to mention that too.
We're mentioning it.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I hope to have you on the program again. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
The murder of Robert Imbrie shows us how fragile diplomacy can be, and how fault lines of history can open in unexpected and violent ways. I want to personally thank Dr. Zirinsky for appearing on the podcast and bringing us this story. I'm Justin Mattson, and if you enjoyed this program, share it with your friends, share it with your family, share it with your dog, and we'll see you next time.